Judge Thomas West sat at the bench staring out over the small town courtroom. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows. Across the rows of empty seats, the room had a quiet stillness that he was accustomed to after years of presiding over cases that seemed to blend into one another. It was a day like any other at first glance. But as the next case was called, his attention was piqued. The name Maria Henderson stood out to him. She was a name he had heard before in passing, but never had it crossed his mind to connect it to the woman now standing before him. Maria was tall, confident, and dressed in a sharp suit that suggested authority. Her poised manner spoke of someone who was used to handling matters with grace, yet there was something about her presence that made West uneasy, not because of anything she had done, but because there was something unfamiliar about her. She didn't fit the typical mold of a person standing before him in court. As a landlord, Maria had built a reputation for maintaining her properties well. She wasn't one of those negligent owners people complained about, yet here she was facing accusations from the city inspector who claimed her building had minor issues that needed fixing. The photograph shown in evidence was of a broken fence and some overgrown bushes, nothing severe, nothing that should warrant a court appearance. But West wasn't about to let something as minor as this slip through the cracks. He had a job to do. He turned to look at Maria once more and saw her sitting silently, her eyes focused on the judge with a mixture of patience and professionalism. She didn't seem rattled by the situation, as most people would be when facing a fine from the court. She appeared calm, almost detached, as if this was another routine part of her busy life. West felt an impulse to make a quick decision. This was a simple matter. After all, the inspector had presented his case, the evidence was clear, and it wasn't as though Maria was known for any past offenses. But then a small voice inside his head urged him to pause to consider the bigger picture. He had been a judge for years now, and his decisions had consequences. But the rhythm of the court, the pressure to move quickly, sometimes led him to make decisions without fully considering all the nuances. He knew better, yet today he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this case. He glanced at Maria once more and then shifted his gaze to the inspector, who was now standing with his arms folded, looking somewhat satisfied with the evidence presented. West turned back to Maria, and for a moment their eyes met. She didn't say a word, but something in her expression caught him off guard. She didn't appear worried or defensive. She wasn't trying to make excuses or downplay the situation. She was simply waiting, and that waiting spoke volumes. With a heavy sigh, Judge West made up his mind. The fine would be issued, the case would be closed, and they could all move on to the next. He didn't have time to dwell on the details. The ruling was clear and in line with protocol. It was easy, it was quick, and it was done, or so he thought. As Maria stood up to leave the courtroom, she didn't show any sign of frustration or anger. She was businesslike and professional, but West couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had just made a decision that would come back to haunt him. The days following the court session were uneventful for Judge West, at least on the surface. The routine of his daily life carried on as usual, but a lingering thought stayed with him. It wasn't just the case itself that bothered him, but the way Maria Henderson's calm demeanor had struck him in the courtroom. There was something about her presence that stuck with him, but he couldn't place it. He found himself thinking about it more than he expected. As the weekend approached, he was still unsettled by the idea that he might have made a hasty decision without understanding the full picture. It wasn't until Monday afternoon that the unexpected discovery occurred. Judge West was sitting at his desk reviewing paperwork when his office phone rang. He picked it up absently, expecting a call about another case, but the voice on the other end caught him off guard. "Mr. West, this is Clara from the property management office. We need to discuss your overdue rent for the building." The voice sounded calm and professional, but something about it made him pause. Overdue rent? He thought to himself that couldn't be right. He had always paid on time, or so he believed. After a few moments of back and forth, he asked the question that had been lingering at the back of his mind: "Who exactly is my landlord?" He said casually, expecting the answer to be a generic company name, or perhaps the name of a distant management firm. Instead, the response was nothing like what he expected. "Your landlord is Ms. Maria Henderson," Clara replied. "She owns the building you're renting." West felt the blood drain from his face as the pieces of the puzzle suddenly fell into place. Maria Henderson, the woman he had just fined in court, was the same person who owned the building he lived in for the past 2 years. His stomach churned with the realization it wasn't just a coincidence. It was a direct link between his professional life and his personal life. He had never made the connection before. It had never crossed his mind that the woman he had seen standing in the courtroom just days ago was his very landlord. His first instinct was to dismiss the thought as ridiculous, but the more he considered it, the more he realized how naive he had been. How could he not have seen the connection? Before he thought back to their brief interaction in court, she had mentioned her real estate business briefly, but it hadn't registered with him that she was the owner of the very building he lived in. West had never paid much attention to his landlord's identity. He had always just paid his rent and moved on, but now that he was faced with the realization, it felt like a weight on his shoulders. He couldn't help but feel a growing discomfort in his chest. Had he been biased in his decision? Was this more than just a simple case of property maintenance issues? Had he been too quick to judge her based on assumptions or even his own subconscious prejudices? The thought troubled him deeply. He tried to shake it off, but the connection was undeniable, and it haunted him more with each passing hour. That evening, West decided to take a walk to clear his mind. As he strolled down the quiet streets of the town, he passed Maria's building and looked up at the windows where he knew his landlord likely sat behind closed doors, perhaps unaware of the internal turmoil. He was feeling perhaps unaware that he had made a decision that would force him to confront a side of himself he had never fully examined. It was only when he returned home that evening that he realized just how deeply the discovery had affected him. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. It was about something far larger, something that demanded introspection and change. Judge West could not shake the growing unease that followed him in the days after the realization. The discovery that Maria Henderson was not just a name on a case file, but also his landlord, the person who owned the building he called home, gnawed at him in ways he hadn't anticipated. As a judge, he had prided himself on being impartial, on applying the law equally to all, regardless of who stood before him. But now, with this knowledge, it felt as if his professional and personal worlds had collided in a way he had never experienced before. For the first time in years, West questioned his own actions, something he rarely did. His decisions in the courtroom had always been based on the facts in front of him, the law, and the evidence. But the weight of his quick judgment in Maria's case felt heavier than he expected. Had he allowed unconscious biases to influence his decision? He had seen Maria as a successful woman, yes, but her race and her position as a landlord, a profession often associated with wealth and power, had somehow shaped his assumptions. Did he see her as an equal, or had he viewed her through the lens of stereotypes, assuming that someone in her position must have the means to fix minor issues without penalty? It troubled him to think that, perhaps, he had treated her case with less consideration than it deserved. West thought back to their encounter in court. Maria had been so composed, so poised, unlike many others who faced legal trouble. She hadn't flinched when the fine was issued. She hadn't protested or argued, even though the maintenance issue in question seemed trivial at best. In retrospect, that lack of reaction had stood out to him, but in the moment, he had brushed it aside. Now he wondered if it was because she had known, all along, that the issue was trivial, that the fine wasn't really about the property but something deeper, something about how she was perceived. His decision hadn't been based on a genuine understanding of her or her situation. It had been a response to a checklist of facts, nothing more. In the quiet of his office that evening, West sat in the worn leather chair behind his desk and closed his eyes. He thought of the people he had sentenced, the judgments he had passed, and how often he had relied on assumptions, on what was expected of him. He realized that in his position of power, he had become too comfortable with the idea of always being right. But now, facing the consequences of his decision with Maria, he realized how dangerous that comfort could be. What troubled him the most, however, was how little he truly knew about Maria. He had seen her as just another name on a docket, a person whose case he could deal with quickly and move on from. Yet here was someone who had built a life, a business, and a reputation that demanded respect, and he hadn't given it to her. He had taken the easy route, assuming that as a successful black woman in a predominantly white town, she must have everything figured out, that a fine was just another minor inconvenience in her life. The more he thought about it, the more guilt weighed on him. He had been blinded by his own assumptions, and that was not something a judge should ever allow to happen. The ruling he had made was unfair, and he knew it. But the question that lingered was what he was going to do about it. How could he rectify this mistake without simply admitting fault in a superficial way? Could he undo the harm that his quick judgment had caused, or was it too late to make amends? These were questions that consumed him as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, contemplating what the right thing to do truly was. The following morning, when West arrived at the courthouse, he found himself restless, a stark contrast to his usual calm. He couldn't concentrate on the cases in front of him. His mind kept returning to Maria, to her face in the courtroom, and to the decision he knew had been wrong. He had to find a way to make things right. He just wasn't sure how yet. The restless thoughts that had plagued Judge West over the past few days finally pushed him to take action. He had made his ruling, yes, but now it felt as though he couldn't move forward without at least understanding more about Maria Henderson, the woman he had fined. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about the responsibility he held as a judge, the responsibility he had to truly see those who came before him, not just as case numbers or convenient decisions, but as real people with stories, challenges, and lives beyond the courtroom. West found himself reaching out to the very property management office that had called him about the overdue rent, the one that had connected him to Maria. It wasn't easy to make the call, his fingers hesitating slightly before dialing. He knew this wasn't something typical for him to do. Judges didn't often seek out people they had ruled against for personal conversations, but something about the situation, about Maria, compelled him to do it. He wanted to see her outside of the courtroom, away from the formalities of the law. He needed to meet her to get a sense of who she really was. The receptionist, Clara, was accommodating and quickly set up a meeting for the following afternoon. Maria would be at one of her properties, meeting with contractors about a new renovation. West tried to prepare himself mentally for the encounter, but no amount of preparation seemed to ease the tension he felt in his stomach. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he knew it had to be different from the courtroom. This would be a chance to talk, to look at the situation through a new lens. When West arrived at the property the next day, he was struck by its condition. It was one of the older buildings in town, but Maria had clearly invested a lot of time and energy into its upkeep. The exterior was well maintained, the yard tidy, and the building itself had a sense of character, something that spoke to the care it received from its owner. As he stood outside, waiting for Maria, West couldn't help but feel a bit out of place. This was her domain, not his. He was used to being the one in charge, the one who gave the orders, but here, in this setting, he was the outsider. When Maria arrived, she greeted him with a warm smile and a firm handshake, her demeanor as composed as ever. She was dressed casually today, her suit replaced by comfortable yet professional clothes that spoke of someone who was both in charge and down to earth. She led him through the property, pointing out the areas where she was planning improvements. There was no pretense in her voice as she spoke about her work. She was passionate, knowledgeable, and completely at ease in this environment. It was clear she had a deep respect for her properties and the people who lived in them. As they walked, they exchanged pleasantries. West asked her about the challenges she faced as a real estate investor, and Maria opened up about her experiences. She spoke candidly about how difficult it had been to break into an industry dominated by men, how she had to fight for every opportunity, and how the perception of her as a black woman in a predominantly white town often worked against her. She didn't shy away from talking about the subtle racism she had encountered, the ways in which people underestimated her because of her race and gender. West listened intently, absorbing her words. He had always known that discrimination existed, but hearing Maria speak about her experiences in such an open and honest way made it feel more personal. It was eye-opening, and it made him reflect on how little he had truly understood about the world beyond his own experiences. He had never been in Maria's shoes. He had never had to prove himself simply to be seen as worthy. As they continued the tour, West felt a shift inside himself. The unease that had clouded his judgment in the courtroom began to dissipate. Here in this setting, it was clear to him that Maria wasn't just another person he could quickly judge. She was a woman who had worked hard for everything she had achieved, someone whose story deserved more than a cursory glance. And for the first time, West realized how much he had overlooked in his initial ruling. This wasn't just about a building in need of repairs. It was about a woman who had built something meaningful, someone who deserved respect, not a fine. By the time they finished the tour and sat down for coffee in a small cafe nearby, West was no longer thinking about the courtroom, about the fine, or even about the case. He was thinking about Maria, about the courage it took for her to get to where she was. And for the first time, he understood what he had failed to see before. Maria wasn't just a landlord. She was a trailblazer, a leader, and a woman deserving of far more than a quick judgment. As they parted ways that afternoon, Maria smiled at him and thanked him for coming. "I'm glad we could talk," she said, her voice warm but cautious, as if she too had begun to sense a shift in their relationship. West nodded, feeling the weight of the conversation settle on him. He had come here seeking clarity, and he had found it. He wasn't the same man who had handed down that fine a few days ago. And he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't leave it at that. The days after his meeting with Maria Henderson were filled with introspection. Judge West had never imagined how one encounter could shift his perspective so drastically. He had come to that property with the intent to understand the woman behind the name, but in doing so, he had discovered something deeper, something he hadn't expected. Maria's candidness, her strength, and her willingness to share the challenges she faced in both her career and her personal life opened his eyes in ways the courtroom never could. He had been blind, and now he couldn't unsee it. The unease that had lingered after the court ruling had transformed into something more concrete. He couldn't continue to pretend that the decision he had made was just another routine part of his job. It was a mistake, one that could easily be brushed aside, but the more West thought about it, the more he realized that doing so would only undermine everything he stood for as a judge. He had to make it right. He knew, of course, that there were no easy ways to undo a judgment. The fine had been issued, and though it was small, it had a ripple effect. Maria was a businesswoman who worked hard for her success, and this fine, however minor, was a symbol of an underlying bias he hadn't even recognized in himself. He couldn't pretend it was just a legal technicality. His decision had been shaped by assumptions, by an unconscious prejudice that had no place in the courtroom. It was early the next morning when Judge West made up his mind. He couldn't simply write it off, dismissing it as a part of the usual grind of court proceedings. He had to go directly to Maria, admit his mistake, and do whatever he could to rectify the harm that had been caused. It was no longer just about fine. It was about accountability, about acknowledging that his position of power had been misused, even if unintentionally. His first step was to call her office. He wasn't sure how she would respond. After all, she had every right to be upset, to feel wronged. But when Clara, the receptionist, answered, West could hear the tension in her voice when he explained who he was and why he was calling. "I understand this is unusual, but I need to speak with Ms. Henderson directly," he said, his voice calm but firm. Clara hesitated, then relayed the message to Maria. A few moments later, West's phone rang again, and this time it was Maria herself. "Judge West," she said, her voice steady, "I'm surprised to hear from you. I'm assuming this isn't just a follow-up about the rent." West paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "No, it's not. I've had some time to think about our last interaction, about the case, and I need to apologize. My decision to issue that fine was wrong, and I failed to see the bigger picture. I let assumptions cloud my judgment, and I deeply regret it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, West wondered if he had overstepped, if his apology was unwelcome. But then Maria spoke, her voice softer than before. "I appreciate you reaching out," she said, "and I respect your honesty. But I have to say, this isn't the first time someone has treated me like that. It won't be the last. The system isn't kind to people like me. I've gotten used to it." Her words struck him harder than he expected. West had assumed that Maria would simply brush it off, that she would be indifferent to the small fine. But her response revealed a deeper truth, one he hadn't fully grasped until now. This wasn't just about a fine. It was about a larger system of bias, of assumptions, and of the everyday ways people like Mariah were undervalued and overlooked. I know, West said quietly, and that's part of why I'm calling. It's not enough to apologize, not enough to just acknowledge that I made a mistake. I want to do more if you'll allow me. I want to make sure this doesn't go unaddressed. There was another pause, but this time it wasn't filled with tension. It felt like the beginning of a shift, a chance for understanding to grow between them. Finally, Maria spoke again. "I'm listening," she said, her tone measured but open. "What do you propose?" West had thought about this too. He knew that a simple apology wasn't enough, and he didn't want to come across as trying to fix everything with a token gesture. "I want to help you, to make sure the fine is removed, and to ensure that the record reflects the truth, that there was no neglect, that the case was mishandled. But more than that, I want to use my position to shed light on how these kinds of biases show up in the system. I want to make sure other people like you, people who are working hard and doing right by their communities, aren't treated the same way." Maria was quiet for a moment, as if weighing his words. Finally, she spoke, a hint of warmth in her voice. "That's a start," she said. "I'll consider it. But I need you to understand, it's not about just making things right for me. It's about changing the system." West felt a surge of resolve. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes," he said firmly. "I won't make this mistake again." As they ended the conversation, West felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had begun to make things right, but he knew the real work was just beginning. The following weeks were a whirlwind for Judge West. What had started as a simple apology had spiraled into something much larger. His conversation with Mariah had planted a seed of change, not just in how he viewed his role as a judge, but in how he saw the world around him. The more he thought about the systemic biases she had mentioned, the more he realized how deeply ingrained they were, how they shaped not just individual cases, but entire legal and social structures. He couldn't unsee it now. West wasn't one to shy away from responsibility, and if he was going to make things right, he needed to take action. He started by meeting with his colleagues in the courthouse, other judges, attorneys, and legal professionals. At first, he wasn't sure how they would respond. After all, bringing up issues of racial bias and systemic inequality in the courtroom was bound to ruffle feathers, especially in a small town where traditions ran deep. But surprisingly, his peers were more receptive than he had expected. The conversation started slowly. West began by recounting his experience with Maria, how his quick judgment had been influenced by assumptions and how, in turn, those assumptions had impacted the outcome of a case. He didn't sugarcoat it. He admitted his mistake, his failure to see the whole picture. Then he opened the floor to discussion, asking his colleagues to think about how often they, too, might have allowed bias, conscious or unconscious, to color their rulings. The conversation that followed wasn't easy, but it was necessary. One by one, the other judges and lawyers began to share their own experiences. Some spoke of instances where they had unintentionally treated people differently based on their race, gender, or socioeconomic status. Others admitted to biases they hadn't even realized they had, acknowledging that they often took for granted the assumptions they had about people in front of them. The discussion was uncomfortable, but it was also enlightening. West realized that, while he had been the one to initiate the conversation, the work had to be a collective effort. It wasn't just about one bad ruling or one apology. It was about addressing the larger issue of inequality in the justice system. There was a lot of work to be done, and it would take more than just a few conversations to begin changing attitudes that had been in place for generations. As the weeks went by, West began to push for new initiatives at the courthouse. He suggested diversity training for all the legal professionals in town, a series of workshops and discussions aimed at helping people recognize and confront their biases. He also called for a review of past cases where racial or socioeconomic factors might have influenced decisions to see if any corrections were needed. It was clear that change wouldn't come overnight, but West was determined to lay the groundwork. At the same time, his relationship with Mariah began to evolve. After their initial conversation, she had been cautious but receptive. As she had said, She didn't want things to just be about making it right for her. She wanted to see lasting change. West kept in touch with her, sharing the progress he was making at the courthouse and asking for her input on how to ensure the system worked for everyone, regardless of race or background. Over time, their conversations deepened. They moved beyond just the specifics of her case and began discussing broader issues of inequality and what could be done to dismantle them. West found himself admiring Mariah even more as he got to know her. She wasn't just a successful businesswoman, she was a force for change in her own right. Despite the many challenges she faced, she remained determined, committed to her work and her community. And though she had every right to be cynical about the justice system, she remained open to dialogue, willing to give West the chance to prove himself. One afternoon, a few months after their initial meeting, Maria invited West to one of her properties to see the changes she had made to improve the building and its surroundings. This time, the encounter felt different. There was no formality, no lingering tension. They walked through the property, talking not just about renovations, but about life, about the future, and about what they could both do to ensure that people like her weren't overlooked or treated unfairly by the very system that was supposed to protect them. When the tour ended, they sat down on a bench outside the building, the sun beginning to set behind them. Maria turned to West with a smile. "You've come a long way since that day in court," she said, her voice warm but thoughtful. "And I can see that you're committed to making things right. But just remember, this isn't about fixing one case. It's about changing the system so that everyone gets a fair shot, no matter where they come from or what they look like." West nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had started this journey thinking it was about fixing a single mistake, but now he understood. It was about something far greater than that, something that would take years of hard work and dedication. But he was willing to put in the effort, to work alongside Maria and others to make sure that justice wasn't just a concept, but a reality for everyone. As they sat in silence for a moment, West felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had taken the first step, and though the road ahead was long, he was no longer afraid of the work that needed to be done. With Maria's guidance and the commitment of his colleagues, he knew that change was possible. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about the future. Judge West's commitment to addressing the biases he had once overlooked began to ripple through the courthouse in unexpected ways. His efforts to open a broader conversation about racial bias in the justice system had ignited something within his colleagues, and it wasn't long before his initiative gained traction. What began as a single conversation had evolved into a movement, one that involved not only the judges and lawyers, but also the wider community. The diversity training sessions were the first step. They were mandatory for everyone in the courthouse, from the judges to the clerks to the public defenders. West, alongside other community leaders, helped organize a series of workshops that brought in experts on unconscious bias, cultural competence, and the impact of race on legal proceedings. At first, there was some resistance. Not everyone was willing to acknowledge the need for such training, especially in a small town where the issues of race were often swept under the rug. But West was patient. He knew that true change would require time, and he was prepared to fight for it. The first few sessions were uncomfortable. Many participants, particularly those who had never questioned their own biases, struggled with the material. The discussions were candid and often awkward, forcing people to confront their own assumptions and acknowledge the ways in which they had been complicit in perpetuating an unequal system. West was surprised by how many people were willing to listen, how many were willing to engage in difficult conversations, even if it meant confronting their own flaws. He realized that while the journey ahead would be long, this was the beginning of something powerful. Meanwhile, Maria continued to offer her support, sharing her own experiences and wisdom about the challenges of being a Black woman in a predominantly white world. She also took part in the training sessions, speaking about the difficulties she had faced in her own career, the prejudices she had encountered, and how she had managed to overcome them. Her presence in the training sessions served as a reminder of the human element at the heart of these discussions, something that often got lost in the theoretical debates about race and justice. As the weeks went by, West began to see real changes in the way his colleagues approached cases. There was more attention to detail, a greater effort to listen to all sides, and a stronger focus on fairness. Judges began to ask more questions, especially in cases involving people from marginalized communities, ensuring that they weren't simply adhering to preconceived notions. Public defenders and prosecutors began working more closely together, sharing resources and information in an effort to ensure that everyone, regardless of their background, had access to a fair trial. But the changes weren't limited to the courthouse. The ripple effect began to reach the broader community as well. Maria's influence, coupled with West's new approach, led to a partnership with local advocacy groups. Together, they organized town hall meetings where citizens could discuss the impact of systemic bias on the community and how to address it. These gatherings were sometimes tense, but they were always productive. For many, it was the first time they had been asked to seriously consider how their own beliefs and actions affected others, especially those from different races or socioeconomic backgrounds. The local press began to take notice. What had initially been a minor story about a judge admitting his mistake had grown into a larger conversation about justice and equality. The story spread beyond the courthouse, sparking discussions in schools, churches, and local businesses. People who had once been indifferent to issues of racial bias were now more aware of the challenges faced by people like Maria and by others who had long been marginalized by the justice system. One evening, several months after West had first reached out to Maria, they sat together at the same cafe where they had met to discuss the case. The atmosphere between them was relaxed, the formality of their earlier meetings replaced by a newfound friendship based on mutual respect. Maria smiled as she took a sip of her coffee. "You've made a lot of progress," she said, her eyes thoughtful. "It's not perfect, but I can see it, and that means something." West nodded, a quiet pride in his chest. "It's been a long road, but I couldn't have done it without you. You helped me see things differently. More importantly, you gave me the courage to act." Maria smiled again, but there was a certain sadness in her expression. "I don't think the fight is over," she said, her voice steady but serious. "This is just the beginning. There's still so much to be done. The system is too big for one person to change." West leaned back in his chair, absorbing her words. He had known from the start that this was never going to be an easy fix. But now, as he looked back on everything that had transpired, from the moment he had handed down the fine to this quiet evening of reflection, he realized that they had started something that couldn't be stopped. A single mistake, a single apology, had led to a collective reckoning with something much larger than any one person or case. It was the beginning of real change, one that would take time, effort, and patience. But West knew it was worth it. "There's still work to be done," he agreed. "But for the first time, I feel like we're heading in the right direction." Maria's gaze softened. "We are, and I'll be right there with you." As they parted ways that evening, West felt a sense of fulfillment, not because the work was finished, but because he had taken the first step toward creating a more just and equitable system. The ripple effect he had started was far from over, but now it had momentum. And with Mariah's guidance, he knew they could make a real difference, not just in their town, but in the way the justice system worked for everyone. Months passed, and the seeds that Judge West and Mariah had planted continued to grow. The courthouse, once a place where West had made decisions based on assumptions, now stood as a symbol of the possibility for change. The conversations that had started with a single apology were now an ongoing dialogue, reaching deeper into the community with every passing day. What began as a mistake had transformed into an opportunity for growth, not only for West, but for everyone involved. The diversity training sessions had expanded, and they were no longer just a series of one-time workshops. They had evolved into a regular part of the courthouse's schedule, with guest speakers, panel discussions, and ongoing training opportunities. The entire legal team, from the youngest clerk to the most seasoned judge, had committed to continuing their education. They knew that to truly understand the complexity of racial bias and systemic inequality, they had to be willing to confront their own blind spots over and over again. Judge West, now a vocal advocate for these changes, often found himself in meetings with local officials, pushing for further reforms. He spoke to town councils and educational institutions, urging them to expand their efforts to address racial inequality not just in the legal system, but in all facets of community life. The more he spoke, the more he realized that these efforts had to be far-reaching and involve everyone: police officers, teachers, community leaders, business owners, anyone who held influence and could help drive the change he knew was necessary. Maria, too, had taken on a larger role in the movement. She had been asked to speak at conferences and forums, where her story became a powerful example of resilience in the face of adversity. She wasn't just the woman who had been fined by a judge. She was a symbol of the strength of Black business owners and the power of individuals to change the world around them. Her work didn't stop at the courthouse doors. She had expanded her properties, offering affordable housing to those in need, and worked with other local entrepreneurs to build a network that supported marginalized communities. It was clear that their collaboration had sparked something bigger. More and more people began to question the structures that had allowed racial injustice to persist for so long. Community leaders who had once been indifferent to issues of racial inequality were now listening, learning, and taking action. West knew that change would never be simple, that there would always be setbacks, but he could see the momentum growing. It was the kind of change that had the potential to shift entire systems, not just within their town, but as a model for other communities as well. One afternoon, West sat down with Mariah again at the same cafe where their journey had begun. It had been a year since their first meeting, and the atmosphere between them was no longer that of a judge and a defendant, but of two people who had forged a deep respect for each other. Maria took a sip of her coffee and looked at West with a quiet smile. "You've come a long way," she said, echoing the words she had once said to him months ago. "You've made real change happen." West nodded thoughtfully. "It's been a journey. I never imagined when I issued that fine that we would be sitting here today, talking about all of this. But I've learned so much from you, Maria. I've learned that it's not enough to just apologize. It's about taking action. It's about doing the hard work to make sure this never happens again." Maria's eyes softened. "I've seen the changes in the courthouse, but I've seen them in you too. I know it's not easy, but you've pushed yourself and so many others to be better." West paused for a moment, reflecting on everything they had accomplished. "I didn't do it alone. The work you've done in the community, the way you've led by example, it's been an inspiration to me. You've shown me what real courage looks like. I don't know if I could have done this without you." Maria smiled again, a little more playfully this time. "We're a good team. You bring the legal side, I bring the real-world experience. Together, we've got something that can make a difference." West laughed softly. It's hard to argue with that. As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin to set outside, West realized just how much he had changed over the past year. He had started out as a man who had made a mistake, who had been blind to the biases that shaped his decisions. But now he was someone who understood that real justice meant taking responsibility, not just for his own actions, but for the systems that allowed those actions to happen in the first place. He had learned that true change required both introspection and action, and he was ready to keep fighting for it. Their conversation turned to future plans, to what still needed to be done. There was no end to the work they had started. But that didn't frighten West. In fact, it gave him a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that change wouldn't come easily, but with Mariah by his side, with the support of the community, and with the commitment of his colleagues, he was ready to keep pushing forward. As they left the cafe that evening, walking out into the cool air, West felt a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't known before. It wasn't because the work was done. It was far from it. But for the first time, he understood the power of change. And with the lessons he had learned from Maria, he knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would lead to a more just and equitable future.